Hello, folks. I can see there's several of you joined already, which is fantastic. It's wonderful to see you this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're joining from. Now, before we get started, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left before we kick off in today's webinar. Feel free to get settled in, grab yourself a drink. And if you're already settled and you've got that drink and are comfortable, maybe just in the chat box, let us know where are you joining from today. And we'll get started in about 3 minutes. Now, as for myself, I'm in York in the UK. As you can see, I'm at home still. And Fiona, whereabouts are you today?
I'm actually based in the Midlands today. So I am a little bit south of Birmingham in the UK as well.
And how's the weather over there?
It was very nice. It started off a very nice blue sky, but it is looking a little bit grey now. So if the light starts to go down, that's because the weather's changing quite quickly.
I can see we've got Steve here as well. Steve's over in London. And Maren's over in Ameland in the Netherlands on vacation. Oh, you've interrupted your vacation to join us. What a privilege. Thank you, Maren. And we have Lisa. Hi there, Lisa. And Ollie, who's in Pretoria. Lovely weather at the moment. I bet it is over in South Africa.
Wow.
And Lisa joining us from Edinburgh. Cool. Oh, good morning, Patrick. Patrick's joining us from somewhere near Ghent. That sounds like you've got lost, Patrick. Hopefully you find your way out of wherever that is. But yes, Patrick's in Belgium. Good to see you. Good to see you with us. Now, I believe we've got quite a few people registered on today's session, and we've got a real breadth of experience on today's webinar, which is fantastic. So people who've been accredited for 15, 20 plus years, all the way through to people who are actually relatively newly accredited. So we're going to be drawing on all of that in part of today's session. And we have David here as well. David is sending greetings from Swindon, who loves a call that starts with a weather report. Yeah. Sorry, David, that is very typically British, isn't it? We do love to talk about the weather. So sorry to the non-Brits on the line. Go on, weather again. Here we go. And hello, Louisa, who's coming in from Leeds. Awesome. Fantastic. So got a minute or so left before we're going to get started. Just wait for the last few people to join. And just while we're waiting for those, we'll recap on these. We'll recap on this when we get started, but feel free to continue the dialogue in the chat box. As you can see, you can set that so that you can send messages to just Fiona and I, or you can send messages to there so that everyone sees them. It's entirely up to you how you want to use that function. But if you want to, sort of sit back without necessarily needing to participate in, via your microphone or via a webcam, you can use the chat box all hour long for today's session. Great. Right, I'm just going to switch that off for a second, and while we get started. So a very warm welcome to everyone joining today. This is a slightly different network member webinar, and we're going to try doing something a little different today with a new format. So rather than having a guest on to share something new or different, we're going to pose a question and then explore that question together. And the question we're going to be exploring is on screen. So do your preferences drive your career, or does your career drive your preferences? And it's a bit of a chicken and egg discussion, this one. So what comes first? Is it your preference or is it your career? And we'd love to hear from you all on this really interesting topic, and we'll talk about where this topic came from very shortly. And in today's session, it's going to be facilitated by myself and Fiona. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm just looking through the participant list. I think most of you I will have met on various networking events, or even maybe on your accreditation. My name is Mark. I'm the managing director here at TMSDI, although many of you will have met me when I was fulfilling a much more of a learning and development role. And I've been with the company for 17 years this year, and I've worked with a number of fascinating organizations and teams. And actually this question has come up quite a lot. Where do preferences come from? what's driving them. And I'm happy to share some of my own personal examples in today's session, but also some of the ones that I've kind of accumulated over the years from some of the groups that I've worked with. And I am delighted to be joined by my esteemed colleague, Fiona. Hi, Fiona.
Hello, Mark, and hello, everyone that's come into this webinar. So just in terms of myself, I work at TMSDI. I have 2 hats. I work as a consultant in organisations and also as a coach, and I work really closely with our portfolio and accreditations. And I've got a background. I've worked in quite a lot of different organisations over my career. And also had the opportunity to work in different functions as well, at different levels. So that has always sparked a curiosity for me about learning and my own, I guess, preferences. But I came about TMSDI over 5 years ago, at least, when I was actually working in development and was looking for a profile to be working with, and I started my work with the team management profile. So really enjoy working with that. And as Mark was saying, just in terms of working with people on a one-to-one or in perhaps a team environment, looking at how our preferences and our careers can intertwine, and maybe explore that somewhat today.
And is it worth saying where this question came about?
Yeah, great. So I was actually delivering an accreditation very recently, actually, and we were having a lovely discussion around our backgrounds and where we had started our careers and what we had really enjoyed at the beginning of our career. And then as we'd moved more into, if you like, self-learning and organizational development and high performance, how through working with profiles and different tools, we learned more about ourselves and got more insight into what we enjoyed. And then somebody who was actually on that accreditation posed this question and said, well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because is it our preferences that are driving us in that way forward, or is it our career that is taking us down this kind of preference path? And I just thought that was such a lovely open question. And as he said, it's a bit of a rhetorical question. Is there really an answer? So we thought, I asked him if I could use that question and we could explore that with some of our network members, and hence having this webinar to really, share some of our own experience and thoughts on this, but also engage with yourselves to find out what you think as well. It'd be really lovely to share that in this session today, I think.
Awesome, thanks, Fiona. And just building on that, we said we want this to be a webinar to be a space that really Fiona and I are going to hold for you, and the content ideally will be constructed by you, our fabulous network. And depending on how you're feeling this Monday, there are a number of ways that you can do that, and to let us know that you have something that you want to share. So you can use the chat function that many of you have been using already. We can set up, we're going to run a couple of polls, and there's also a Q&A feature. So for those of you who've not been on one of our webinars for a while, you'll see that we've switched to Zoom. That gives us a whole range of other functions over and above the platform we used to use. So there's a really neat questions and answers feature. So you'll find those in the little bar underneath. If you wanted to submit a question, you can submit it in a way that other people can see that too. And others, if you like the idea of that question, or if you'd like Fiona and I to chat around that question, you can upvote it to see that it sort of rises to the top of the pile. So you can do that by clicking on the question if you see it. Now, ideally, what we'd love to do is to be able to invite some of you onto the panel today and just chat with us on the call. So if you're happy doing that, you don't have to have your webcam on, it's just going to be audio. Just click on the hand raising icon at any point, and we'll be able to just unlock your audio so that we can hear you and everyone else can hear you. If there's something that you'd like to share, that would be absolutely wonderful. And full disclosure, we have absolutely no idea how this webinar is going to go. We've not planned for any particular questions or comments or interpretations of this topic. It's really down to you. So the idea is that we know that we've got some super experienced practitioners in the session today, and we'd love to hear from as many of you as possible. And for those of you who are joining who don't have lots of experience in this space, this is hopefully a safe, supportive environment of peers who you can share your questions and share your thinking with. So the only thing we have prepared is a little research extract, which kind of showcases how likely preferences will change over time, and we'll do a bit more on that later on. So we have until 1:30 to complete this discussion, and some space for some questions as well. Before we do, however, I'm really interested to see if there's initial thinking around this. So I'm going to just launch a little poll. What do you think in this chicken and egg discussion? Which one is true for you? Do your preferences drive your career? Does your career drive your preferences? And we have to have a cop-out response, right? It depends. It depends on the context.
Yeah.
If anyone's feeling super bold to go for one of those initial few questions or statements, fantastic, and we'd love to hear from you. Likewise, if you genuinely think that it depends, we're really interested in that side of things as well. So I think most of you have voted. I'll just give it a couple of seconds more, and we'll look at some of the results. Okay. And you may well find that your thinking's changed at the end of today's session, and if it does, fantastic. Okay, right, let's have a look at some of the results. So there's a pretty clear winner here so far. Almost 60% of you have said that you feel, for you, your preferences, your work preferences drive your career. Yeah, definitely, followed by it depends. So only 30% of you said that, and then followed by 13% who think it's your career that drives your preferences. Interesting. Okay, so what's lovely here is we've got a diverse set of opinions, and would love to draw on that diversity today. So if you've got any thoughts that come into your mind as we're going through today's session based on what Fiona and I are talking about, or based on what any of our other network members are sharing, please drop a link in the chat box. If you want to say something, raise a hand and we'll invite you into the discussion. Okay, so we have Lisa, who's already got a hand up. Lisa, would you like to, you can unmute yourself and talk if you wanted to, I believe. Hi, Lisa. Hi, we can hear you. Oh. Okay, I'm just going to lower your hand for now, Lisa. We'll come back to you. If you do want to share something, pop your hand back up and we'll come straight to you. Before we get started with anyone else on the line, Fiona, do you want to start us off by sharing something of your own experience around this topic? In your experience, has your preference driven your career or vice versa? What's it been for you?
I think it's changed. I think over time it's gone from perhaps one to the other. So I think it's constantly evolving. If I think of back at the beginning of my career, going into work for the first time, it was all completely new, and so the first role that I was doing was very much new, and I was learning and practicing and experimenting and getting feedback from that. But I think I also became quite curious as I moved organizations and as I moved perhaps into different functions, because I was always interested in how different functions work together to be really effective across an organization. And I think by doing that led me to recognizing that, different functions were delivering different things, and how they did that had a focus on different types of work. And I think, for example, when I think about some really big projects that I worked on, those would very often have that kind of future focus in terms of where we were heading, would have that planning element in it as well. So it was very much about where we were heading. And I do very much enjoy that kind of, where are we going, for what purpose? But then as I moved into other roles, there was an opportunity that, rather than perhaps a project being defined or established already in terms of what we were doing, about coming up with ideas, which really sparked my imagination, I think, in terms of what could we do? Could we do this differently? And so I started to find that there were certain work, if you like, types of work that I felt very perhaps naturally drawn to and really enjoyed. And there were other types of work that I would perhaps be working with others and see them doing effortlessly and very, very well. And I actually found some of that a little perhaps a bit harder. So that was quite curious to me. So I think as I picked that up, I started to notice what I was enjoying, what perhaps was a little bit taking more effort. And then through, I guess, development over the years, and through self-awareness and learning, that has helped me to, of course, understand perhaps some of the reasons for that, and areas that perhaps I enjoy more, and areas to be more aware of, or perhaps areas that are not so natural, if that makes sense. So I think for me, it came from that initial curiosity that I think I always have about, well, I'm doing this, but I wonder what about that? And that always seems to play into that kind of future focus. So for me, I think as I've built up a knowledge over time of work, then my preferences have started to inform more of my career. But I would say earlier on, I think it was more the career and that initial career path that were starting to make me aware of preferences, and then it's kind of tipped a little bit more into that space. But I do think there's absolutely a space for it depends as well, because I do think different contexts and different situations can be completely unique to us as an individual, and that can have an impact as well.
Yeah. So it sounds like you've covered all bases.
Well, I think if I had to sum it up, I think they all have that relationship and interplay. But I think on my journey, it's gone more from the career, more into the preferences. And then it makes me wonder whether it will next be more of it depends before, who knows, maybe it flips back again over time. I think it's such an open question. But it'd be really interesting to hear what other people have found for themselves as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got a lot of chat come through actually where you've been sharing your story. So thank you for sharing that, Fiona. I'll share some thoughts from my own, but I'm really keen to make sure we include as many people as possible. So great sort of challenge from Patrick, which is this the right question? What is driving a career? What is driving work preferences? And as of when does it not matter anymore? I guess a very philosophical thought there from Patrick. You know, maybe it just is. Doesn't really matter. I'm kind of, I could see that. And actually this kind of times with something I wanted to build on, which was this idea, this very well-rehearsed law that we talk about within the TMS world. And this is actually, I think this came from, Charles Margerison and Dick McCann's very initial writings around this. The first book they released, they talked about the law of the 4 Ps. So this is really to try and answer the question, where do preferences come from? You know, regardless of what's driving what, where do they come from? And the 4 Ps law follows that we practice what we prefer, and then in turn we become proficient, and then this gives us pleasure from our work. And I think that's really valid still. But I can also see an argument for that law working in reverse. So, you know, in seeking out a new career opportunity, maybe we've got to learn a new skill or learn a new way of working, it can actually work in the other way. So actually we have a proficiency that we need to become adept at. We practice more of it. And over time that turns into a preference where it wasn't before. So I think there is a bit of kind of toing and froing of where preferences can come from. I think it's can rather than where they do come from. So Elka has shared here. So Elka says what she found for herself, she can adapt and develop preferences based on the job requirements, but most pleasure that she finds in the types of tasks that are a good fit to her preferences. Absolutely. And we'll come on to talk a bit more about that a bit later on, maybe, Elka, this idea of, you know, fit and what does balance look like? What could balance look like? Now, Diana's put she agrees with the comments, but she's also raised a hand. So I'm just going to allow you into the conversation, Diana. If you want to unmute your line, you should be able to. Hi.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Perfectly well, really clear.
Yeah.
Well,
Go on.
I have a question for both Mark and Fiona, or anybody else who finds themselves in this situation, because the question that we're exploring today is a question that I get from people that I coach. And how do you help them understand or precisely where they are in their career? Because I find a lot of people that I coach, if they're very experienced, let's say they're looking at their career with 25, 30 years of experience, they tend to look, they have that bias of retrospective. You know, you tend to want to justify why you did something. But obviously, if you're looking for someone to coach you, it means that you might have some doubts, you know? So how Fiona, would you approach somebody in that moment of their life that they've got 25 or 30 years of experience behind them? They've done their, you know, their team management profile. They have an idea of their preferences, but they're tending to look back at their career rather than forward, and thinking what they can get out of that to make them understand better precisely how they answer that question, because a lot of people don't know how to answer it.
Yeah, that's a really big, that's a big old question. Mark, do you want to just try and start with that one? I'm just going to reflect on that, if I may, for a moment.
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
That's a good question.
Yeah, so I like how you frame that, Diane, about the bias of retrospective. You almost want to justify where you've been and build that into where you're going. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yes, because sometimes it's difficult to know how to, well, of course, help someone move forward when they have such a strong bias, and you're not sure if it's bias. You know, because you say the question of what drives your career. Well, let's define career.
Yeah.
Sometimes we tend to usually, well, as Fiona was saying, when you're in your first jobs, you don't really think of it as your career. You know, you're just getting experience, and you start looking at it as a career as you sort of gaining experience and understanding better where you want to go. So that's a question that I find myself sometimes in difficulty in helping somebody answer for themselves. When you have that strong, well, I have it myself. I mean, I have over 35 years experience, and I tend to look back, and I love to think that all my life was driven by my preference, but is it so? You know, how do you help somebody else answer that? That is my doubt. If somebody can help me with that one.
So I've got a couple of thoughts on that one, and they're both about downplaying all of this. So I think you've sort of hinted at this already, Dan. I think there's the nature of a career and how fixed that is, how part of it, how much of an identity is that for us. I think, so I've got, my son's 3, and I was thinking about this the other day, like I think it's going to be absolutely common and commonplace for people of his generation to genuinely have multiple careers. So the idea of having maybe even 1 or 2 careers in our lifetimes is quite common now, but I think it will be quite common for people in his age bracket to go, you know, 6, 7 times round into different industries, completely different professions. And I think that's a really freeing concept of actually, you know, our career does not have to be completely bound to us and our identity forever and ever. And I think letting go of that is quite a helpful place of moving on, and also a helpful place of being able to look out of the current box that we find ourselves in, or we may have placed ourselves in. And another piece is that this is just one part of the puzzle. So the story that we tell ourselves about, you know, our career and our preferences, no matter what our profile says, it becomes part of a narrative that we repeat to ourselves. We know, and we'll come on to talk about this a bit later on, that preferences can change over time. But this is unlike some other tools of this nature, where they say actually what we're measuring is fixed in stone and it will never change for the rest of your life, and it's been with you forever and it's driving everything. That's not the philosophy that the team management profile follows. It's actually that preferences can change, and they do change over time, not drastically and not dramatically, but the capacity for change is there. And again, I think that's a really freeing concept, that we all have the ability to change and, you know, adjust that story and the narrative of what our career path looks like. I
think just building on that, I think it's a really good question. I find that in terms of, if a previous career or that history of where someone has come from to where they are now. So exploring that perhaps need or that desire for recognition of understanding that, because that has been a significant, part of someone's career so far. I think that if I just think of the team management profile on its own, just as a tool in its own right, because it gives us that opportunity at a moment in time to understand people's preferences. And I know, Mark, you've got some material coming up where we're going to take a look at how those might evolve over time. But I think there is something about an acknowledgement of what has gone before, kind of where we are now, and then that work with individuals in terms of the recognition, the knowledge of that, and then exploring the present and taking that further in coaching conversation in terms of their future and where they are heading. But I think it is a bit of a lifelong question. I think that's a question, like you were saying, it's a question for yourself. I think it's like a question that we probably all kind of have, and we have the opportunity to explore that when we're doing the coaching. But I would think there is something about that past, present and future as we work with somebody.
Brilliant. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the challenge, Diana. And hopefully that's helped you with your thinking. I'm just going to take a couple of other chats that have come through. So Johan's got an interesting comment here. So I think we can develop the skills required by the job, absolutely, but agree with Elka that pleasure and passion comes from preference. Johan says we can probably get a PhD with ease in your preference space. Interesting idea. And you can still do it if it's not a preference, but it will probably take more effort. Really important point that around, this is just one part of the mix. It's not about skill or ability. It's purely about preference. Really good. Yeah. I think that's kind of also where I was going with Diana's question around downplaying it. This is part of the mix of what things might make up your career choices. Faye's also said, does the learning curve impact job satisfaction? And when it begins to flatten, maybe motivation fades too. Absolutely. I would totally agree with that, Faye. I think that's a really valid comment. Okay. Do we have anyone else who's wanting to talk? So Paul is here. Paul, over to you. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me okay, as they say? Testing, testing, testing.
1, 2.
Perfect.
All right, okay. Anyway, look, I just wanted to throw a spanner in the works.
Doesn't sound like you were Paul at all, Paul.
Yeah, that's what I've come on the call for. I just wanted to put a bit of controversy in there for you, Mark. If there's a train coming down the track and you happen to be on the track, I think my preferences might change to getting out of the way rather than having a discussion with the train as to whether it's going to knock me over or not. So I think circumstances perhaps trump preferences. I think I thought where you were going to go earlier about your 3-year-old son, about multiple careers, etc. I also added there'll be no such thing as retirement for him either, or not in the concept of which we understand it today. But I think the current generation will have more choice, but I think for perhaps sort of, I don't want to mention age here, but I'm one of your older callers as well. But sort of when I was 18 or 19, I had to get a job. I needed to bring money and I needed to pay the rent. Yeah. I didn't sort of go against my preference. I just got a job. So I do think circumstances very much play a part in this, and I don't think you can divorce that from the question of what my preferences are. So I would just throw that one in for you to think about.
Thank you, Paul.
And I think building on that, I like the example of the train, and in different situations and different contexts, like you say, then that kind of desire for preference perhaps you know, cannot be there or isn't there. And like the example that I think I gave, I think when I went into my first job, it was my very first, you know, job in the world. I kind of didn't know what I didn't know. And as I went into it, I started to learn the bits of it that I did enjoy and didn't enjoy. And that didn't mean that I could just go straight off then and find, oh, this is what I want to be doing. I needed to build up a knowledge bank. I needed to build up knowledge about myself. And so just building on what you were saying there, for a period of time, I have previously had you know, a role or a job where you're doing that job, and that is, you know, perhaps what is the job at that moment in time that's right for the right situation. So and I think they just kind of build over time. But then there are certain situations where with an awareness of my preferences, I know there's a point where I go, I need to now shift into here. This is where I need to be going. So I guess over my time at work, it's that evolving self-awareness. But going back to the very beginning of my career, I didn't have that. I was there to do what that job was, and that's what I did. And I didn't have the ability to step back, which perhaps over time you get that opportunity, and working in this space of, you know, high performance and development, to be able to reflect and consider perhaps what has gone before and where you are now.
Super. Thank you both. We have another hand raised from Patrick. Patrick has, you should be able to unmute your microphone now.
Yep. Oh, good. Thanks. There's many questions that come to my mind, and one is to what extent do preferences ruin your career? That's a thought. Secondly, a pleasure can make you can lead to burnout, because you can become addicted to your work too much. But what for me is important is a question like, to what extent do preferences influence your ability to effectively apply your linking skills? Because linking skills is what makes or break your success in your career. And there is also a difference between when you start your career, when you start your work life, mostly you do that as an individual contributor. And when you choose to go through the path of management and not to become more into a specific expert, your preferences may influence your leadership style. It may not, as of a certain moment in life, you can actually be successful in whatever career, as long as it is not a specialist and expert function. I think preferences do influence when you are an expert, because you could be overwhelmed with details and you're not, you know. But so the linking skills are for me important. And are you in a managerial role where your job is to coordinate, to help people to shine in what they are doing, but not actually doing yourself, more into the enabling and mobilizing and facilitating and all of that? So yeah, those are a few thoughts, but linking skills is something I want to bring into the discussion here.
And rightly so. I think it's such an important piece of the puzzle, isn't it? Having, you know, well-defined, well-honed linking skills in order to bring awareness to all of this, but then, you know, make sure that we are not leaning into any biases, shall we say. I think just building on what you were saying there, Patrick, there's something that made me think about is if you were in a managerial role, maybe if you were in a kind of career mentor type of role, just being aware that your preferences may inadvertently start guiding other people's career choices. through your own biases and your own lens that you apply to other people's thinking and other people's career decisions and the kind of conversations you might have in that place. So it's yeah, thank you for all of those. I'm absolutely, my mind's just been a bit blown by the question of, can your preferences ruin your career? I'm gonna have to go away and do some thinking about that. Anything you wanted to add, Fiona?
I think just on the linking piece, I find that so interesting. And you know, again, apologies, I feel like I'm playing out a career story here, but I just felt like I noticed very early on that in organizations, that linking and people and that communication piece was so critical. And yet it was interesting that perhaps, you know, you start to notice that some people perhaps do lots of linking, and they might be in a management position, or they might not. They might just be as a contributor, but actually very effective at keeping other individuals they're working with really well informed. And I think that linking really comes into that whole individual team leadership management. It glues everything together. And so again, understanding perhaps our preferences in terms of how we prefer to do that linking, because it is so critical, and how over time, how that can evolve in terms of perhaps becoming, for some people, perhaps more comfortable doing more linking, or identifying what works really well for them and for the people that they're working with. But I think it's really the glue, and is exceptionally critical to all of this.
Thank you. We've got quite a few hands raised, so I want to make sure we try and get to everyone. And I also could see there's quite a few chats in the chat box, which is wonderful to see. I wanted to cover Laura's point, because a lot of people have actually said thank you to Laura, but directly to Fiona and I. So Laura wouldn't have seen this, but a few people have just said thank you, really, really appreciate your thought here. So Laura has said, I think the most value in this question comes with honing into self-awareness. What are my preferences? How can I develop new preferences? And if a preference develops into a strength, overusing that strength may translate into a weakness. So reinforcing self-awareness of current preferences and how to develop new preferences or strengths is what I am after. Absolutely. So quite a few people have just said thank you. Yeah, absolutely agree with that. Yeah, and I would chime in with that too. So I wanted to just cover this from Maren as well. Maren has shared she currently wears two hats. One of the hats is for her own enterprise, in which she's much more creative and she's able to use her preferences. And then in the company that pays her salary, where she needs to be more process driven and reach further out of her preferences, her personal work preferences. And what she's finding is that she's not as bad as she thought with processes, but she derives her energy from the creative portion of her life. I think this is such an interesting point, because I'm reading a lot about, particularly during the pandemic, people have, started a side hustle, maybe, started a little business on the side. It's not really paying for the mortgage, but is something that's maybe a little creative outlet. And I wonder sometimes what that's going to do to preferences over time. Will there be split sort of work identities, one of which represents the kind of the job, in inverted commas, and the work persona, and the other one that's more of the sort of creative side hustle, or maybe it's a practical side hustle, depending on your preferences, that taps into the stuff that you're not getting from your current bill paying career. I think we'll see more discussions like that emerge over the years, particularly in the wake of the pandemic, where so many people that I've been speaking to have been taking the opportunity to try that and try something different in a safe space, in a sort of, in a side hustle.
Like a hybrid of our preferences in terms of, and that recognition of, like in the chat box, in terms of for this role, I'm using my preferences here, but over here, I'm doing this, and I'm aware of that, and I recognize the energy and the balance that's coming from those.
And Mari's actually just put her hands up. So did you want to, I'm just going to allow you to unmute Maren. You can join us on the call if you want.
Hi.
Hi.
Testing.
Good to hear you.
Lovely to see you again, Mark. It's been a while.
You too.
No, what I've also found actually within my creative side, and I still sort of laugh about it. I actually make crossbody straps. I taught myself how to sew in the pandemic when I was out of work. And I've realized that I'm not as bad as I thought also in approaching people and saying, hey, I have a great product to sell. Not just in my Etsy store or on Instagram, but I've actually approached store owners, and even on vacation, I took straps with me to take pictures and said, oh, well, here you go. I'm in a store. Hey, do you sell these things? No, you don't. Would you like to buy some?
Good.
out of nowhere, which is a side of my personality that was more hidden, that you find yourself within your pleasure, the side that gives you energy and pleasure, that you're learning new skills as you go along and developing new preferences as you go along. And I take that now also a little bit to the process side of where the company that pays my salary these days, I'd say it's a kind of a draining exercise. So I'm trying desperately to find the creative sides within the processes to still use my preferences and where I know that I have the talents and skills in, and apply those to the job at hand as much as possible, to still walk out with a little bit of a feeling of, hey, yeah, this was okay today, and I'm not, oh God, I can't bear it anymore, I need a new job. So this topic is really so fascinating for me because of this dual role hat that I'm wearing.
And in a way, I think a lot of people, in maybe not as an extreme way as having generally have set up a separate business. I think a lot of people feel that way, Marion, about, you know, having to juggle various different roles within their work identity. It's one of the most fascinating aspects of working life, contemporary working life, that, you know, that we all wear multiple hats, and we sometimes have them placed on us by other people rather than choosing to wear them.
And what one of the participants had said regarding do our preferences drive us into possibly a burnout? I also recognized that part in my previous life job, that you give so much of yourself because you enjoy it so much that you sort of put yourself down on the lower end and don't think of yourself, and you think of everyone else or the job itself much more. And through that, although you think you're deriving getting energy out of it, you're actually at the end of the day depleting your energy too much, and can then go
yeah.
So it's such a balancing act. But I do wonder if this pandemic if you'll see a total switch in things, in how people approach their work life. I'm sure we will find out.
I do think there will be a shift, and we'll have to look at, see what our research says around that at the time. We've got a few other hands raised. Thank you so much for sharing that, Marion. It's really wonderful to hear from you. Paul, you've had your hand up for a little while. Did you want to build on that?
I have a course called Be the CEO of Your Life, and I think this is all about leadership, and I think this is just another tool, for want of a better phrase. So I see the team profiles and the linking profiles just as, it's just something that gives you an awareness. There's lots of comments in the chat about awareness. And I just think you just need to be aware of these things. I think that human beings can be very, very resilient, or at least we should be resilient and resourceful. And I think, therefore, that just knowing this means that you know whether you're putting yourself in an uncomfortable space or not. And equally, sort of one of the things that I'm looking at the moment is lots and lots of people are now, there's more and more small companies that might be 1, 2, half a dozen people, but they need to be pulled together into effective teams to do, say, projects for bigger organizations or bigger projects. And if you're going to be a participant in that, how do you create a fast, high-performing team, which doesn't have to go through all the stages that if you all worked in the same company, you'd know about the other's warts and all, whereas you actually, it's very much a personal responsibility issue that says, hey, I know that I'm bad at this. I need to make sure that if I'm joining a high-performing team, I know that I'm rubbish at, let's say, audit, but on the other hand, I'm very creative. But I can use the creativity and just be a complete pain in the neck. And I also need to be able to identify that if there's 4 or 5 creatives in the group, then there's maybe too many, and maybe I have to go to my second preference. Or maybe if I just need to be within this team, how do I best perform within this team? And so I very much see this all as an awareness tool as to how you get the best out of yourself in every situation, rather than actually, driving towards preferences as a way of life for your career. So I would actually see people, perhaps their career, driving this a little bit. Like Fiona said, that when you try something, you might find you like it. On the other hand, you might find you completely hate it. So I would like to say that this is, for me, this is an effective tool around self-leadership and how you and self-responsibility. I think that will be the context I will put on this. And I'm not going to say anything else in the rest of your meeting now, because I've had far too big a say.
Not at all, not at all. Thank you for sharing, Paul. And you've made me think about something else, which we'll share a bit later on, around how you widen the net for things that you might prefer that we may not have considered before. But absolutely. Sorry, Fiona, were you going to jump in there?
No, not at all.
We've got a couple of other hands raised, and I would like to get to some of the other points in the chat as well. So Diana, I'd like to invite you back. What did you want to share?
Yes, and I promise after this I won't speak anymore, okay? But it's very interesting. I know that it's difficult to give a sort of a number or a percentage to how much of our job consists of something that is within our comfort zone or our preference zone or not. But in HR, when I was in HR, we used to recommend the following, and I'd like to have your view on this, because although it's very difficult to actually give a number to the amount of time or energy one spends doing tasks or the parts of our job that are strongly within our preference or not, but we had a system where we would say, okay, for example, for internal job posting, if this job is less than 60% of your time not within your preference area, don't take it, okay? And if it's more than 80%, don't take it either. There's no job in the world that will allow you to be 100% of your time, all the time, in your preference area, right? And precisely stretching yourself and even doing some of those tasks that initially are not perhaps very interesting or stimulating for you, but we would work around that. What do you think of that? Because this was an American investment bank. You know how American banks, they love numbers. So we would say this was a sort of a pie chart, and we would analyze people's jobs and say, well, if it's going to be more than 60%, less than 60% of your preference area, you're not the right fit. If it's over 80, you're not the right fit either, because you don't stretch enough. What do you think of that? Does that make sense? I can't hear you.
Sorry, Fiona, did you want to pick up on that one as a starter?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, just bringing that into a very specific, it does make me think of the team management profile when I'm delivering accreditation, which does look at that kind of balance and gives kind of 3 scenarios in terms of what's a good match in terms of our role and our preferences. And Majerus and McCann in the profile talk about a 2/3 overlap being ideal in terms of that opportunity to have that stretch and the potential for growth within that. But with that 2/3 overlap, giving that level of comfort, if you like, as well, in terms of that match. And then it breaks that into the 3 situations in terms of if that's if that's an ideal or something to aim for, then obviously where there's no overlap, then that's the situation where there can be a mismatch, and sometimes we see people not staying in a role for a long period of time because there is that kind of disconnect there. And then a situation, it does sometimes happen. I know you mentioned perhaps it doesn't happen, but that absolute match where there is so much overlap, but that doesn't provide the space for growth in the way that 2/3 does. And so I think in terms of those, if I think of those 3 from just the team management profile, that's what kind of stands out to me. I don't know, Mark, if you wanted to just build on that.
Yeah, you took those thoughts right out of my brain. I was going to say exactly the same thing. The only other thing I could think to add to that is, isn't that interesting that that number of 2/3 sits very in the middle of those 2 numbers that you quoted, Diana, of less than 60% or more than 80%. It seems to be about that level intuitively that seems to make a difference. The other thing I sometimes throw into those conversations is, and I do think balance is a better word than fit. And it's the psychologist in me gets very obsessed with language. And I think trying to find a fit, again, it implies permanence, whereas balance is something that's a bit more fluid and can evolve. This is a slight adaptation of Csikszentmihalyi's flow model. Originally it was challenge versus ability, whereas actually if you map the challenge of a role against something like work preference, here is where you will find aspects of flow coming through in people's work, where and as coaches, particularly career coaches, we're working on those borders, aren't we? We're working on those borders between just on the edge of flow into stress, or on the edge of flow into boredom, and trying to either understand where those borders are, but also push people to explore more, because actually another way of talking about flow could just be comfort. Maybe towards the boredom side, there's an aspect of flow, the layers of it, where it is just we are comfortable. And I think that's where you get into that 80% of time that you were talking about there, Diana. So I think this can be an interesting model to sort of throw into those discussions, where you can maybe explore whereabouts are you, where would you like to be, in your current career, future career, alternative careers, and what would need to change from your current state in order to get you to that place. And that's your window into what should hopefully be a nice coaching conversation. Yeah, does that help, Diana?
If my can you still hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
No, it does, absolutely. And the flow chart is great. And for the first time, Mark, I think I know how to pronounce the name. Can you say it again? I never dare pronounce.
You're assuming that I know. It's well, I always go with Csikszentmihalyi.
Csikszentmihalyi. Well, okay. Well, I've learned something really important.
Gosh. Yes, here he is, sort of sweating, hoping that he's got the pronunciation right. Please let me know in the chat box if that's completely wrong. Patrick, you've had a hand raised for a little while as well. Would you like to say something else?
Let me start by saying it's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It's it's sometimes also Csikszentmihalyi, but it's Csikszentmihalyi, I believe. It's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, whereby it's interesting, your chart, normally in his chart, work preferences is actually replaced by doability, isn't it? And to the extent that work preferences help to get you into the flow, I think the quality of the flow, and then when you talk with the 4 P's about pleasure, it releases adrenocorticotropine. So it's a kind of a part of the group of hormones, neurotransmitters, and peptides, and a lot. So yeah, no, my hand was initially raised about just recent finding in Belgium that 15% of people are addicted to work. Just and then secondly, I believe that preferences can divert people from a certain career. It's not about driving; it's about the opposite. It's about not going into a certain career. So yeah.
Yeah, I that was one of the thoughts I had when we were starting this webinar, thinking, I wonder if anyone's had that experience of their preference. When we talk about driving, it always assumes that it's forward, whereas actually, preferences could be responsible for somebody leaving a career, potentially a very, lucrative, very successful career. And I wondered if anybody might have had that, that experience.
I had that experience. I am not a professor. I'm linked with a lot of universities as a visiting faculty, and I love my work as delivering training programs, leadership things, team development, and whatever. The reason I'm not a professor is that I don't like academic work. I don't like the research. And that is clearly my preferences. I believe that although I had the opportunity, I had a job at university, but I was unhappy with it. So and then I said, no, it's not for me, and then I went into the applied section. So that's definitely something I believe that drove me away from that glorifying position of being a professor at the university.
Thank you so much for sharing, Patrick.
Thank you.
Faye, you have raised your hand, which I'm really glad, because you've been posting a lot in the chat. You should be able to unmute your line now. Before you do, I wanted to just jump on something. One of your latest chat messages was, I believe the future is about designing your own career and the kind of contribution we make through our work. I love that thought. And if I may, I just wanted to recommend a book which just chimes to that belief, which is something that came out a couple of years ago. It's called Personalization at Work, by an author called Rob Baker. And the entire topic and subject of the book is around that statement that you made, Faye, in the chat. So thank you for that. But I say over to you.
Thank you very much for recommending the book, and thank you for picking up the thought. We've talked a lot about preferences, but I believe our preferences are driven by values. And when we walk away from a career, we're walking away from, not from preferences, but I think we're walking away from values that don't match what we're really looking for. We're walking away from something that doesn't fit in with our highest aspirations. And I've walked away from careers. I was a dean at university, and I submitted a resignation, and people said, "You're crazy. Why would you walk away from a position like that?" I love the content of the work. I was teaching communication media, which I excel at, which I still do in so many ways. But the mismatch of values, the lack of opportunity to exercise creativity, to be somewhat independent in decision making, and to have an impact without the restrictions of the academic limitations that get placed on you,
is what drove me away from that position. And when I think of what I'm doing now, I do a really good job of designing experiential learning that really transforms the way people see things, gives them new insights, and I truly enjoy that. And when I am doing that, I am working within my preferences, and that's what keeps driving me. And the growth within your preferences comes from honing that skill, from refining the skill. But I haven't walked away from my preferences, and I think that's because they're quite strong. In other areas, when the preferences are less pronounced, I think it's easier to make those shifts and adjustments when the preferences are lower scale. But I think becoming conscious of what my strengths imply, like lack of attention to detail, I have become so much better at that. But the caution is, don't do it for too long. So, I can sustain that at a certain level of quality by saying half an hour at a time, an hour at a time, that's it. And I can do it well then, but not over a period of time. So I just wanted to say values really impact a lot what we do with our preferences, and being aware to balance out our weaknesses or potential liabilities of the strength with other people in the team is critical.
Lots and lots of comments in the chat there, just in agreement with you on those points, Faye. Anything you'd add, Fiona?
I would really, support what you're saying there, and I think again, just bringing it back to the awareness. I think that builds over time as our experience grows, and maybe different roles or different jobs that we complete, that values awareness perhaps becomes more visible or known to us, or that match or mismatch feels more conscious to us. So I find that really interesting, and I'm just thinking, how that potentially can grow, and maybe we observe and notice that more during our career as we learn more about that for ourselves, and as you say, as we refine our work in that space. So
yeah, I totally agree.
I know you will know this because you're accredited in all of our tools, Faye. But for those of you who've not looked at some of the other tools in the TMS suite, particularly things like the QO2 and the window on work values, you'll see that does present a total picture of behavior at work. And Dick McCann conceptualized this as, I don't have this as a visual, so I'm trying to do it with my hands on screen, a pyramid. And it's more like a prism of if you shine light through this prism, actually you'll be shining it through all sorts of different things, such as values, such as kind of risk, change orientation, and of course preferences that we see. And I think Dick McCann's view would be very much in support of what you've said, Faye, which is that the preferences that come through on the surface that are very easily observable in people, and as we can see on this call, so many people are very comfortable talking about them, are actually, if you peel the layers back, actually what we're looking at is values. And they come through as observed behaviors. They sort of filter our behavior, and they filter our decisions, particularly around our careers.
Absolutely agree. I just want to close with an acknowledgement that when I did my TMP many years ago, it was life-changing. And I'm actually still within the same range of preferences. I'm an assessor developer, and I'm doing what I love.
Wow.
So
well, thank you for that comment, Faye, because that brings us very nicely on to one thing we just wanted to finish off before we close, which is around, we've talked on the subject of this webinar around, is it, where do preferences come from? Do they change? Can they change? Our research shows the following. Some of you may have already read this in some of our research manual, but this is from our test retest research. So certainly we find that preferences as measured by the team management profile are stable over short periods of time. So back to that conversation we were having with Diana, they can change. there is the ability for that to change. What we found is that over a period of 4 years, the individuals we studied, 96% had no change, or maybe just had changed on one measure only. So yeah, they would certainly be within that 96 bracket. 4%, the remaining 4% had changes on just 2 of the work preference scales. None of the individuals that we covered in this study changed on any more than 2 measures on the 4 scales. So it's very unlikely that this will change over time, but if it does, it's a very incremental shift. But we always say it's a really good discussion opportunity. So if you do see a change, yeah, so there's an opportunity to share, compare what's prompted the change, what's been going on that may have led to a change in outlook, change in perception, change in preference. And yeah, I think Patrick's just mentioned this in the chat here around career journeys. You know, we talk about career journeys in the context of what we do, but we very rarely talk about career journeys in the context of how we do what we do, or how we prefer to do what we do. Right, goodness me, hasn't that time flown? We're already at time already, and we've had so many amazing comments. We've gone from a very huge question: do your preferences drive your career, or does your career drive your preferences? And we've talked about awareness, we've talked about context, we've talked about culture, we've talked about values, we've talked about what is a career, we've talked about leadership. Thank you so much to everybody who's commented in the chat, who's shared a personal story, who's shared an example from their own organization and their own career journey. It's been wonderful hearing from you, and I hope this is a sign of things to come, that this can be the kind of webinar that we do, that's more like an informal conversation between, you know, a peer network, which is what we've got in this amazing practitioner network here at TMSDI. Anything you'd like to add before we close off, Fiona?
Just to say thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed it, and it's some brilliant questions. There's a lot that's come through in that chat box during the session, and yeah, so thank you for those, and thank you for sharing, because I think it is that sharing, and also building on each other's you know, real stories, that is so interesting. And I think the values one is a really interesting one to end on as well.
Absolutely. And when you leave the session, you will be prompted to leave some feedback. Let us know what you thought of this. This is a total experiment for us, something a little different. And if you have any suggestions for a future question or a topic that we could cover in this kind of format, just let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And you will we'll hopefully have several more of these to come in the month to come. In the meantime, if you you'll notice there's all kinds of news and updates coming from our team at the moment. We've got some amazing software offers running for those of you who use our software. We've got a number of different accreditation offers running if you're thinking of getting accredited in any of our tools, not just the team management profile. And of course, we have our brand new self-paced online accreditation now, so it means you can just learn in your own time at your own pace whenever you like. So thank you so much for all of your lovely comments as well in the chat. A huge thanks to my co-host Fiona, as well as everyone who contributed. You will find our full archive of guest webinars over on YouTube. If you want to go and find TMSDI on YouTube, you'll be able to go back and review some of the other webinars we've had in the past. And in the meantime, enjoy the rest of your Monday and have a brilliant week. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.